Hi, and welcome back to our study of essential beliefs. I hope you're having a great spring break, and I hope you're taking advantage of some time off if you can have that with your family. I know many people are. A lot of folks are traveling, and I want you to know you're in our thoughts and prayers, but I hope you have a great time and are able to spend time with loved ones and family. My grandfather on my father's side was named Orion Parker. It's spelled Orion. He went by Orion. Lost my granddad when I was about 9 years old. He lived in Whiteville, Tennessee, where he farmed 250 acres. They were not wealthy people. In fact, they were rather poor. Lived in a house that was old when I was young. Didn't have indoor plumbing. Had an outhouse. It was called hot and cold running. Hot running in the summer and cold running in the winter. When I was young, we would take baths in a wash tub on the back porch. Some of you can relate to those kinds of things, but that lets you know a little bit about kind of their standard of living. My granddad was known throughout Whiteville. Whiteville is a town now of about 4,000. Not sure what the population was back then, but he was known. He served on the city council, served on the school board, and one of the things that he was known for was being a man of honesty and integrity. Now, a lot of that I found out about later, reflection of people in the community when we would go back to visit my grandmother after my grandfather was gone. In fact, there was a businessman in town by the name of Mitchell who owned a kind of a general store. My granddad used to walk us up to that store from his home, and I've mentioned before, he would let us buy all the candy. Anything that we had the guts to ask for, he would get. And after he had passed, I had gone back just nostalgic to visit Mitchell's store before it went out of business. And I was talking to Mr. Mitchell, and I was in my early teens at this point, and he was telling me about my granddad. And he said that, with your grandfather, you never even needed a handshake. Whatever he said that he was going to do, he did. And he would rather be cheated than to ever go back on his word, or he would rather be cheated than ever be accused of going back on his word. My grandfather instilled those kinds of things into my father. And my father's name was very important to him. His integrity was very important to him. And he tried as best he could to pass that on to my brother, my sister, and myself. One of the ways that Dad would do that is when he would instruct me to do something, he would tell me once. After the first time, I was busted. My dad would come. I've never heard the man raise his voice, but if he had told me to do something, go change the oil on the car or something like that, and I was loitering and being a teenager and just lazy, he would come back and he'd simply say, "Steve, what did I tell you to do?" He didn't tell me twice. First time he told me, second time I was going to be disciplined. Now that was important to my dad. And a lot of people I think today misunderstand that or that principle. He was a man of his word. Now we consider being a man of your word a great principle when the promise that goes along with it is good, but it's just as important when it promises discipline or punishment. One cannot be just with rewards and unjust with consequences. My dad was a man of his word. If he told you something, that's the way it was to the best of his human capability. So if he told you to do something, he told you once. I assume my grandfather was the same way with my father. And that's a part of justice that I don't think we understand. And that's the part of integrity that goes along with being just or with justice, is you can bank on my word. I don't have to tell you many times. I don't have to swear or put my hand on a Bible. If I tell you, that's the way it is, or that's the way it's going to be. Now, when we understand God from that perspective, it really helps us to understand a concept that really we tend to not like, and that's justice. Many of us view, or we grew up to kind of view, the God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New Testament. That God was nice in the New Testament, but that he was mean in the Old Testament. Now, we understand and we were taught that God doesn't change and he's never changed, but I think sometimes we have trouble or have had trouble justifying the two different perspectives of God. God at his mercy and God at his justice. Because we look at God from our need, and our need is mercy because we fall, we sin, we're imperfect, etc. We don't look at the world or life or reality from God's perspective. We don't look at justice from God's perspective. What I want you to understand is eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, which is a great summation statement of justice, is so important to God because it has to do with credibility and trust. If you can't trust me at what I say, there's no basis for faith. If there's no faith, there's no salvation. So when God said to Adam and Eve, on the day that you eat thereof, you will die, they tested him. Really? They tried him. They tested him. Well, surely he'll give us a second chance. I don't think they went through that process, but as we go back, project ourselves onto them, kind of like children will, well, what happens if I don't? Kind of thing. But God is a God of his word. He is just. He is righteous. He is pure. So if he tells you on the day you eat of it, you will surely die, you're going to die. There is no second chance, because a second chance means you can't really believe what I say. You can't take me at my word. Then God becomes non-credible. And understand, when we're on the receiving end of an injustice, like God was on the receiving end of that injustice, we take it very seriously. We want God to be just. We want him, and he's promised that he will be for those that he stands for. But it's hard for us to understand that what appears to be mean from God is simply God being credible, being trustworthy. If I tell you the way it is, that's the way it is. If you can't trust me that I'm going to discipline you, then you can't trust me that I'm going to bless you. So the basic concept of eye for an eye, as we've talked about, is justice. Guys, it's so important to any family, neighborhood, state, nation, civilization. For men to be able to coexist with men, there has to be justice. There has to be an ability to limit one person's negative influence on another. Now, the root word of justice is just. To be just is based on or behaving according to what is morally right or fair. Now, I want you to hold on to that term, fair, because that's what justice is. And when we're saying things like that's not fair, what we're crying for is justice. To be just is guided by truth, reason, justice, and done or made according to principle, equitable, and proper. Equitable is another way of saying fair, equal. Okay. So the term justice means just behavior or treatment, the quality of being just, righteous, equitable, or morally upright. So the notion of fair, of right, of equitable, of moral rightness, these all come into this concept of justice. Now, we don't live up to justice. We don't live up to God's expectations, so we need mercy. And that's where we came into the story, is after Jesus had been to the cross, and we are learning about mercy and grace so that we can be saved. And therefore, we look back at the Old Testament through the eyes of the cross, and we say, man, I'm glad I didn't live back there, because God was very mean back there. I mean, open up the ground and tens of thousands of people killed, all of those kinds of things. The term fair means marked by impartiality and honesty. It's free from self-interest, prejudice, or favoritism, conforming with the established rules. So justice and rule and fairness, all of those go together. So without rules, there can be no justice. Without fairness, there can be no justice. Without honesty, there can be no justice. Without self-interest or prejudice, there can be no justice. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, etc. So as I mentioned, when we say that's not fair, that's a cry for justice. In fact, it's an interesting aside that our concept of a county fair or a state fair, the origin of that term really goes back to competition of livestock or things like that. So the idea was you could bring your livestock, you could bring your quilt, you could bring your cake recipe, and they would be judged fairly at the county fair. In Luke chapter 18, verse 1, we have the story of the widow's desire for justice. Now, he was telling them a parable to show them at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. There was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him saying, give me legal protection from my opponent. Now, stop there just a minute. What she's saying is, this is the law. I need you to uphold the law so that I can get protection from my opponent. And for a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection, lest by continually coming she wears me out. Now, he's not giving her preferential treatment. He's not saying, I'm going to give you what you want to get rid of you. In order to get rid of you, to get you off my case, I'm going to give you legal protection. I'm going to give you justice. And he said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now, shall not God bring about justice for his elect, who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them speedily. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? So Jesus is saying, you cry out in your oppression, you cry out when men harm you, and God, who is a just God, is not going to ignore you. Now, he may delay justice, but he's not going to ignore you. He will bring justice for them speedily. You see, she was crying out for justice because she had been wronged. What she was asking or pleading for the judge to do was, give me fairness. I want equalitarian treatment here. I want to be treated just like anybody else. Now, he didn't fear God, he didn't fear man, so he wasn't doing his job. And she wore him out, and he finally gave her justice, not favor, not mercy. He gave her justice because he was tired of being worn out. She, in a sense, by her pleas for justice, got him to do his job. In our culture right now, there are many boiling undertones crying out for justice. And without eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, there's really no way there's going to be met, because we have opposing folks, like the woman who went before the magistrate said, my opponent, those who are opposing me are making my life tough. I'm crying out for justice. What's just for the Me Too movement, for women who have been mistreated? What is justice for Black Lives Matter? Is it justice or is it preferential treatment? What is just for me? See, there's a backlash against the Me Too movement. There's a backlash against the Black Lives Matter, because there are people who are saying, oh, wait a minute, what's just for me in this situation? What's just for unborn babies? What is just for a baker who does not want to celebrate a gay marriage or be a part of the gay marriage by being involved in it? What's just for a gay marriage? You cannot negotiate justice. It's not subjective. It has to be authoritative. If you remember from last week, our Jenga blocks, they have to be standards. It has to be authoritative. And as we notice with the blocks, we're removing the authority. We're holding on to the principles in a sense, but when we take their authority away, there can be no justice. Without authority, nobody can be on the right side, and that's what we're facing in our culture. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, abortion, all of those have become political issues because they're determined by courts, they're determined by human beings. So there can't really be a right side because there's nothing authoritative. Without God in the picture, those laws can change. And as we've seen, with both of those movements, Me Too and Black Lives Matter, the mores in our culture have moved. And as the mores have shifted, then things get redefined. But there's no authority. There was no authority for the mores before. There's no authority for the mores now. So there's just going to be that clash because there is no justice, because there can't be justice without authoritative law. So it comes down to control. It comes down to being powerful or to trying to be empowered. And I think sometimes in certain movements today, what people are seeking in the name of justice is actually power. Now, what happens then is as power goes against power, then we have riots in the streets, we have warfare, we have, and one of the things that concerns me about the term social justice warrior is that they are advocates of social war. And war is when there is perception that there is no justice anymore. I won't receive justice. So now we have to go to warfare. We have to go to rioting. We have to go to destruction. We have to go to violence. We have to resort to those things because either there is no justice or justice is not being presented. Now, before we go any further, I want to remind us of something because as you discuss these ideas or read about them, what you're going to find is these principles that we're talking about, these essential beliefs. Many critics are going to say that the Judeo-Christian ethics and laws upon which this nation is based are all borrowed. There were nations before Israel. You had Canaanite nations, you had Mesopotamian nations, etc. Israel came along and borrowed those. Many of the same critics will point out that many other cultures had flood stories. And Israel came along later and kind of borrowed their flood stories. Now, the common fallacy that they're making is attributing Israel, the beginning of Israel, to the giving of the law about 1300 BC. When Moses led the children of Israel out of Canaan and the law was delivered, that's when they established that the nation of Israel actually started, when they had their laws, because laws are foundation to being a nation or being a civilization, etc. But you and I understand that Israel, the children of Israel, go way back beyond that. They go back, 2 millennia to the promise to Abraham. The thread goes all the way to Adam and Eve, that before the law was what we call the patriarchal period, where God was speaking directly to patriarchs, fathers, and he was giving verbal law. He was giving verbal interpretation. And up until Moses at Sinai, these things were passed on from father to son, from God to father, father to son. And then you went into the Mosaic period where they are actually written down. So critics make a mistake in saying, and it's an understandable mistake, but when they attribute the beginning of Israel to the giving of the law, they misunderstand the history that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. And it's great that God has given us that lineage so that we understand that all the way back to God's covenant with Abraham led up to hundreds of years later before Moses was able to lead Israel out of captivity, and therefore the beginning of the written law, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how critics are making mistakes. So what I want you to understand is everybody else who has any form of eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, or the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you, they've actually borrowed it from the children of Israel. They borrowed it from God, who gave it first to the fathers and then later gave it to in writing for perpetuity. Deuteronomy chapter 19, there's a discussion about false witnesses. Now, this goes back to justice. And I want you to understand the relationship between witness and justice, because God's a just God. But in order for the gospel to get out, the story of Jesus to get out, it's going to be based upon witnesses. It's not going to be based on proof in the traditional sense of scientific proof. It's going to be proof like in a court based on testimony. So in Deuteronomy 19, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the men who had the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and judges who will be in the office in those days. And the judges shall investigate thoroughly, and if the witness is a false witness and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. And the rest will hear and be afraid, will never again do such a thing among you. Now, I want you to see, there's several things in this that eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Whatever this false witness was wanting to have happen to his brother that is falsely accused is not going to be done to him. So everybody else, you'll get rid of the evil that way. It's not gonna keep festering. Everybody else will hear about it, and they're never going to do such a thing again. What's that? One guy bring a false charge against another. He needs to have 2 or 3 witnesses. Now in verse 21 of that, it says, thus you shall not show pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now guys, you and I both know that so much that is going on right now in our culture, and this is one of the problems of the Me Too movement, is one person's testimony, another person's testimony. Under the law, that wouldn't have been accepted. We say that's not fair to the victim. Well, what that goes to, and I don't have a lot of time to spend to this, is lifestyle. What it goes to is, don't put yourself in a situation where there's not another witness. Don't go into a hotel room with someone by yourself. Don't don't even consider going on until way into a relationship, going on a date by yourself. Let there be someone with you. That's the way folks used to date. It wasn't one-on-one. My Aunt Sadie had to go with my mom when she went on a date, not just for protection and propriety, but if something went wrong, there's a witness. And now we have double testimony. So it's not about being unfair to the person who's been charged. It's about a lifestyle change and looking at the ways that we do things, because one person against one person is not acceptable under the law. And that protects the integrity of a lot of different people. Now, does that mean that someone could be violated? Yes, it does. But this testimony is so important because they're going to be false prophets against God. There's going to be given false testimony all through history. And God's protecting this testimony thing because that's the only way we're going to be able to come to know him. So 2 or 3 witnesses is foundational to eye for an eye justice. Because testimony is how all biblical truth is established. So what I mean is the veracity of the Bible, the presence of God, the reality of God, etc. It's also how God protects the reputation of elders. Anybody can get mad at an elder and bring up a charge. But Scripture has already established it, and it's got to be at 2 or 3 witnesses. So this is how he protects leaders. This is how he protects the repudiation of his gospel. This is not saying it didn't happen. It's saying it can't be proved. It creates a situation where little is done in private. And that protects everything. It protects the truth. It protects the individual, etc. Justice doesn't travel or make dealings alone. Always does it in a group. A notary is someone who witnesses a legal document so that the matter comes up. It's not me against him, him against me. It's a notary that says, yes, that's the person that signed it, etc. Deception walks alone. Deception works in the shadows. Truth doesn't. Truth is always out there to be seen by everybody. So he's not discrediting that a person can be violated. The challenge is bringing a charge and proving it. And again, that goes back to lifestyle change of being very, very reticent to put ourselves in a situation where a charge can be given to us because of one-on-one. Deuteronomy chapter 13, if your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend, who is as close a friend as your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, the gods of the people who are around you, near you or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other. You shall not yield or even listen to him. You shall not pity him, nor shall you spare or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. So you shall stone him to death, because he has sought to seduce you from the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So someone that says, let's go serve this other God, and this person is a friend who is like my own soul, then you don't protect him. You don't pity him. He's brought before before the clan, or he's brought before the nation, and what? Stoned. And I throw the first stone. Afterwards, all the people do. One reason God wanted everybody involved in this is how you learn. When you see it done, first person, it teaches you. Is it severe? Yes. Justice is severe. But remember, it's based on the severity of the crime. You see, we forget that it's eye for eye. If you don't want to have to deal with severity, don't do the crime. That's what God's trying to teach them. That's why if a kid in a youth group, a Jewish youth group, became rebellious to his parents, the penalty was to be stoned. You know who threw the first stone? The youth group. It made an impression. Man, I don't want this to happen to me. And it does make an impression. You see, when capital punishment's done in a dark room somewhere that nobody sees, it doesn't have any impact on people. It doesn't change their behaviors. When I was undergraduate at North Texas State University, my minor was in sociology, and I was taking criminology classes. And one of the things that kept being talked about was capital punishment doesn't work because it has no prevention to it. I raised my hands once and said, it has no prevention to it because of the way that we do it. First of all, I have no reason to believe that if I'm given the death penalty, I'm ever going to be killed. I have no reason to believe that, because rarely does it ever happen. Secondly, it's never done to where anybody else sees it. It's done usually in the darkness of night. It's done without fanfare. And early morning, you see a hearse. If you're around, you see a hearse leave the prison with the body in it. It's done as if in shame, etc., rather than presenting that, know this, if you do the crime, you will do the punishment, and everybody's going to see it. So when he's talking about this thing about false gods, he makes it very, very clear that you're not to show pity. You see, justice doesn't show pity. Justice pays an eye for an eye, or it's not justice. And if it's not justice, the word of the lawgiver cannot be believed. I don't believe you're going to do this. I don't believe you're going to follow through with this. Let me ask you a question. If you were to commit a murder, do you believe that you would most certainly be killed in the United States of America? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life. You probably don't. Because rarely is it ever. Now, are you advocating that? What I'm advocating is justice is justice. Mercy does not invoke itself or impress itself into a justice system. Mercy is a different kind of justice. We talked about last week. It's Jesus' eye for my eye. It's Jesus' tooth for my tooth. Justice is still met, but he pays it, not me. And you see, that doesn't work in a criminal justice system because you can't invoke faith base into that. Whereas Israel, their doctrines, their religious doctrines, were also their laws. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 18, do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who continue in sin rebuke in the presence of all, so that the rest also may be fearful of sinning. See, even in the New Testament, you have that notion of rebuke in the presence of all. The reason this is done is not to embarrass people. It's not to bring shame. It's for everybody else. We don't do everybody else very well in this culture. 2 Timothy 2, you therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, these entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So he's talking about where grace comes from. It comes from Jesus. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 28. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has resulted in the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Now, what Paul's saying is justice is terrifying. But remember, the person who's under justice is the person who's done the crime. It's terrifying to do the crime because of the justice. Justice is not bad. It's not being mean. It's not being evil. In fact, it's being fair. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin so easily entangles us. Let us run endurance the race that is set before us. There's the witness idea. And all these things about truth has to do with witnessing, and that has to do with justice. 2 or 3 witnesses, all of those testimony, all of that comes into play. Matthew 12, verse 18. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. Now, I don't have a lot of time to spend on that. I need to move on because we need to get to a different subject for next week. But think about that. Jesus is going to proclaim justice to the Gentiles. What's the justice for the Gentiles? It's damnation is the justice for, no, but it's a different justice. It's a justice to where Gentiles can meet the just requirements of God through the blood of Christ, who came from the Jewish nation, ministered to the Jewish nation, yet is going to proclaim justice to the Gentiles. How's he going to do that? Testimony. Now, under the law, there was the notion of the goel, the one who, the justice seeker, the one who brought justice for his or her family. And if you remember, there were cities of refuge. If a man committed murder, then the town brought him forth and he was stoned for it. Now, if he committed what we would call manslaughter, he could run to these cities of refuge, and the family could not come and get him and exercise justice. And it's interesting that when someone was murdered, it's the family. Now, they used the justice system of Israel, but the family was at the forefront. They were the ones throwing stones, etc., because eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Now, that doesn't bring their partner back, but as we talked about last week, how many people today talk about, how many victims talk about, I never got a sense of justice? Because our system is so mercy-oriented that, people get multiple chances, you get parole, you get all of those kinds of things because we're trying to save humanity from their sins by using parole and all. But see, justice can't do that. Now, is our legal system right in doing those things? Well, they work outside of the orientation of God. They work outside of the parameters of God. They have infused a kind of quasi mercy system into a justice system, and what happens is it really often undermines justice for the reasons we talked about before. If I murder someone, I have every reason to believe I am not going to be killed for that I'm not going to have to pay for it with my death. Okay. So under the law, you had this idea: if someone kills someone accidentally, they could run to a city of refuge. And it wasn't that they got out of justice, it's that they received justice for a lesser crime. You see, the crime fit, or the justice fits the crime. Now, the thing is, they're not free. They have to live in that city of refuge till the priest there dies. If they ever leave that city of refuge before that priest dies, then the Goel can find them and kill them. The brother, the father, the son, the nephew, the next closest relative can kill this person. And not only legally do so, it's expected because that's what justice demands. So the law allowed for a difference between murder and what we would call negligent or accidental death. This wasn't mercy. It was eye for an eye for a lesser crime. But again, notice in Israel there was a convergence of crime and sin. Their doctrines were their laws, but that only works in a theocracy. Mercy can't be blended into law. Law doesn't do that because law is about justice. Mercy is about Jesus becoming our justice, or our taking on our justice through expiation. So when we read about, say, probably the closest thing to Old Testament justice that we would see today is going to be in many Arabic nations. Now remember, the Arabs and the Jews arose from the same Abrahamic line. You had the Arabs who came, or the Israelites who came from Abraham's son by promise, Isaac. You have the Arabs that came by Ishmael, his attempt to bring about the promise in his own way. So we've got justice that we see in Arabic cultures that we look at and we say, oh, that's terrible. But it's more like Old Testament, that the beheadings, which are their way of doing stonings, chopping off hands for a thief, or in other cultures, caning people. And we look at, if you remember, caning came out, I think about 20 years ago. Some of our people were caught Middle East nations, and they were given the punishment at that time with caning. In America, we were, it's brutal. They're barbaric. We're civilized. Well, what does that all mean? Well, we're a kinder, gentler people. What does that mean? We don't stand much for justice. And because of that, we water down mercy. So what we have is, I'll give you another chance. And this is often conflict between mothers and fathers, discipline versus nurture. And it's really become extreme in the last century. It's the idea of counting to 5. Don't let me count to 5, find you doing that. Or don't make me tell you again. Or don't make Dad come out there and have to do this or that. Remember, my grandfather learned, you say it once. My dad learned from my grandfather, you say it once. Then after that is judgment. When you count to 5, child learns that they have through 4 to disobey you. So between 4 and 5, they need to change. They learn to distrust you. In our culture, if you fail the test the first time, you can take the test again. There was a woman in West Virginia that took her driving test 257 times before she passed. Are we sure we want her on the road? We know in our culture, if I'm a minor, I can get away with a crime, especially if I have no offense. If I have no record, and drug runners know this. They use kids. They will impress kids into duty because they know that kid's not going to receive. It's the idea of you get another chance, another chance, another chance. The cost of that is we don't believe you. We don't believe your laws. We don't believe your justice system. Teaching mercy is teaching disobedience. It means we don't mean what we say. 3 strikes and you're out, like California came up with a few years ago, means you better be careful after your second offense. And it so permeates our culture that justice seems harsh, terrible, or mean. Now, one of the problems in our culture is I'm convinced there are many, many people walking the face of the earth in America that believe they're going to get a second chance for God. They believe on Judgment Day it's going to be, all right, you took the test the first time, which was your life, and you failed it, but you get another chance. Oh, we're going to let it go. That's not justice. Now, mercy means our justice is met through Christ. Without that, there's no other chance. And because we've taught them so many different ways, you get another chance, you get another chance. Good try. Then they believe God's going to do the same thing. Because it's good people who are doing that, so they must reflect God. God is a just God. Guys, for us to understand God and to understand the importance of justice, we have to understand eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And it never has changed. And it won't. Now, Christ will mediate it for our sin in the presence of God. That's the only mercy there is. Otherwise, what it is injustice, unjust, untrue, untrustworthy, non-credible. And God can have no part in any of those. I hope you're beginning to see the incredible negative impact of a justice society that's based on injustice, that does not understand eye for an eye and will not invoke that for mercy, for the sake of a false sense of mercy that undermines the credibility of the law. God said, on the day you eat thereof, you will surely die. And they did. On the final day, he's going to say, depart from me. I never knew you. But God, don't we get a second chance? No. Justice. Without Christ, there is only justice. And justice doesn't repeat itself. Justice doesn't give do-overs. Justice is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Justice is harsh because the crime was harsh. Justice is brutal because the crime and the damage and the harm to other people was brutal. It's a tough lesson, but it's a great God because we can believe him not only in his promises, we can believe him in his discipline because he means what he says first time. God bless you. I love you. Look forward to seeing you face to face. Look forward to our next session of looking at essential beliefs. See you soon.